you.
Okay, great. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Türk eğitim ve akademik dünyası hakkında neler düşünüyor? Akademik eğitimi kendisi nasıl buluyor?
So many of
Amerika'da birlikte çalıştığım çalışma arkadaşlarım, özellikle mühendislik, bilim ve matematik alanlarında birlikte çalıştığım arkadaşlarım, hepsi Türkiye'den geliyor. Yani bu demektir ki siz burada bir şeyleri gerçekten çok iyi yapıyorsunuz.
Turkey. So you are doing some very good things in your educational system. I do know that Turkish
Şunu biliyorum ki Türk bilim adamları gerçekten çok profesyonel ve çok iyi işler yapıyorlar.
they do very successfully.
Buradaki eğitimle ilgili, çalışmayla ilgili neler önerdiler? Onu da merak ediyoruz.
At the circle table, we
İçerideki
discussed
toplantıda eğitimin daha sinir bilime dayalı bir versiyona geçiş yapması hakkında konuştuk. Ve bu şekilde Türk öğretmenlerinde geleneksel yöntemleri sinir bilime dayalı yöntemlere nasıl uyarlayabileceklerinden bahsettik.
involve using traditional approaches that Turkish teachers use.
Özellikle gelecek yapay zeka ile şekillenecek gibi bunu kendi yöntemine nasıl empoze edebiliyor? Yani bu kendi anlattığında yapay zekanın yeri nasıl acaba? Onu anlayabiliyor musun?
AI stands
Yapay zeka bu durumda iyi ile kötü arasında bir noktada bulunuyor aslında ama teknolojik gelişmelerin bize getirdiği şeyler de böyledir. Hani ne iyi ne de kötü tarafa koyabilirsiniz.
with every technological innovation.
Yapay zekaya da ben de bir soru sordum. Barbara Oakley ile yan yana geldiğim zaman en çok neyi sorarsın diye ona bir soru sordum. Zor ve karmaşık konular üzerinde etkili öğrenme stratejileri geliştirmek için beynin yapısını, işlevini nasıl daha iyi kullanabiliriz?
You need to build it.
Bir duvarı tek seferde inşa edemezsiniz. Tek tek tuğla uğraşmanız gerekir. Bu aslında öğretmenlerin yaptığı gibidir. Geleneksel yöntemlerde de böyledir. Tek tek işlemeniz gerekir.
For people to learn.
Genel itibariyle bizim gördüğümüz kadarıyla bilgiyi edinmek kadar bilgiyi yönetmek daha önemli hale geliyor gibi dünyada.
So as far as we understand throughout the world, it's more important to manage the knowledge than learning it.
Bunu en sağlıklı nasıl yapabiliriz? Kendisinden bir öğrenmek istiyoruz.
Sometimes it's thought that to manage the
Çoğu
knowledge
zaman bilgiyi yönetmenin bilgiyi öğrenmekten çok daha önemli olduğu düşünülür. Ama yönetebileceğiniz bir bilgiyi edinmek için de bunu öğrenmeniz gerekir. Beyninizde bu bilgiyi iyi kullanabiliyor olmanız gerekir.
information in your memory to manage it.
impress and give it to them, and they will think you are really creative. And you are creative. You're actually co-creative with some of that great innovative material from generative AI. So what is a transformer? Let's take a look. It's composed, it has two parts. It has the encoder, where you feed in the prompt, and incidentally, this part right here, this tiny little part where it says positional encoding, that's where the vector word embeddings take place, and a big number is created that relates to all the other words. But you enter a prompt into the encoder, and out of the other side, the decoder, comes the information that you need. Now, what is interesting from our perspective is not the fact that there's a transformer, but that it does relate to the fact that the flow of information through a transformer is remarkably similar to the flow of information through a human brain. And what this tells us is if we know a little bit about how the brain works, we can use generative AI more effectively. So let's dive into how the brain works, at least a little tiny bit. This is like your 2-minute tour of neuroscience. So the brain is composed, for our purposes, of a fundamental building block, and that is the neuron. And the neuron has this particular neuron has 3 legs, they're called dendrites, actually a real neuron can have hundreds of legs. It can have little toes coming off those dendrites, and these are called dendritic spines. And then it has an arm that reaches outwards, and that's called an axon. So what neurons do is they like to reach out with their arms, so to speak, and tickle the toe, tickle the dendritic spine of an adjoining neuron. And what they're actually doing is they're sending signals from one neuron to the next neuron. And what this is doing is it's whenever you are learning something, you are simply creating a connection, a connected clump of neurons in long-term memory in the neocortex, in the brain. Now, unfortunately, psychologists and educators, well-meaning though they were, for the last few decades have been saying, you don't need to remember things, you can just always look it up. But would I speak Turkish if I always just looked it up by going to Google Translate? Of course not. You have to have those links in long-term memory if you are to be an effective expert at anything. Now, how do you strengthen those links? Well, you practice. And you practice in certain specific ways. And what happens if you don't practice? So, for example, I had a student who, he came up to me, he waved a test in front of me and he said, how could you have flunked me in this test? I understood it when you said it in class. Sometimes we think conceptual understanding is the only golden key to learning, but that's wrong. Because if you can't remember what you understood, all bets are off. You still haven't really learned it. And what can happen is if you don't practice with the information, learning, your little synaptic janitors can sweep those spines away and off the connections go. So learning involves creating nice, strong links in long-term memory that you can easily pull to mind when you need them. And this brings me to an important point, and that is the idea of metaphor. So if you think about it, let's say you're teaching about electrical current flow. How can you explain that to somebody? Well, you know that when you were a little kid, you played with water, you tried to figure out how water flows. Once you get the idea of how water flows, you can use that as a metaphor or analogy to explain how electrical current flows. So metaphor is a powerful tool. It takes concepts you've already learned and uses them to help bridge into new concepts. So I want to give you a special example of that. So when I was working on this book called The Mind for Numbers, I reached out to thousands of professors who were evaluated as the top teaching professors within their disciplines. Economics, engineering, psychology, education, whatever. I reached out to thousands of top professors and I asked them to evaluate the manuscript for this book. They got back to me with all these great insights, and then, but I was surprised because many of them told me something that I hadn't really thought about before. They would independently say to me, you know, here's some advice on the manuscript, but there's one little extra thing I do as a professor, and this is the magic that makes me seen as such a powerful teacher. What was that one thing? And incidentally, they said, I do this one thing, but I don't tell the other professors that I do it. What was that one thing? It was the use of metaphor and analogy. And why did they not tell the other professors that that's what they did? Not because they were trying to keep it secret, but because when they tell it to the other professors would say, oh, that's why you're so popular as a teacher. You just make it so easy for your students. But isn't that our job as professors, to make things easy for our students? Actually, making things easy for students is really hard. And once you're done, they think it's easy, but it's not. So metaphors will always break down. For example, we know that water flow is not a very good metaphor for electrical current flow if you're talking about a quantum level. But whenever a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away, you get a new metaphor. But how do we come up with metaphors? People used to ask me that, and I'd say, well, you read popular books, you go to websites where they'll give you metaphors for computer science or whatever. But now you can just go to ChatGPT. There's lots. You just ask for a metaphor. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are looking for a metaphor that explains the difference between main guard and scope in Python programming. So ask ChatGPT, and it will give you all sorts of really good information. For example, main guard can be seen as the gatekeeper of a castle, and scope is like the rooms within a castle. And then it gives you a lot more information. So you can ask for a metaphor to help you explain to students what is a difficult concept, whatever difficult one you're trying to convey. And students themselves can ask for metaphors. But don't just ask for one metaphor. Ask for 5 metaphors. Tell it a little bit about yourself or tell it about the students. And it will give you some wonderful, wonderful metaphors. Marketing groups used to take large numbers of people on a team and spend weeks to come up with just the right metaphor to convey an idea about how a pharmaceutical might work in the 30 seconds of a television advertisement that they might have available. But now, we don't need big marketing teams, and we don't need a number of weeks. We can come up with really good metaphors very, very quickly and efficiently. So, while we're speaking of metaphors, I want you to think about generative AI using the metaphor of a car engine. And what that means is, if you're thinking about ChatGPT versus, for example, Claude, it's just like a different engine in a car. Does that mean the handling characteristics might be slightly different? Yes. But once you've learned to drive one car, even if you get in a different car with a different engine, you can still drive that other car. So large language models are very similar to one another. But there is, as I mentioned, a bit of a difference in handling characteristics. So, for example, Greg Brockman was formerly the president of OpenAI, and he famously came up with it. He wrote down on his notebook pad a little information. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "My really dumb joke website